What is the difference between sex trafficking and prostitution? Do they intersect, or are they two completely distinct crimes? How hard is it to differentiate between a case of prostitution or sex trafficking? We'll dig into all this and more on today's Dragonfly Human Trafficking podcast.
Hi everyone, my name is Whitney and I'm the Executive Director of the Dragonfly Home.
I am Melissa and I am the Director of Communications and Development for the Dragonfly Home.
Welcome to today's episode of the Dragonfly Human Trafficking podcast. In honor of Human Trafficking Awareness Month, we're addressing our month-long campaign, Getting to the Truth, Common Misconceptions about Human Trafficking. Today, we're talking about our fourth misconception, which is prostitution and sex trafficking are two completely different crimes with no overlap.
The truth, of course, is that it is way more complicated than that. The line between prostitution and sex trafficking can really become blurred. I think in our trainings that we've done, this is a pretty common question.
Right. And so pimp-controlled prostitution technically meets the legal definition of human trafficking. Many of these victim survivors that we have been able to assist are sold by pimps, and they may not see themselves or identify themselves to others as victims. So that makes it a little bit harder. Again, when we talked about this too last time, that so many of these victim survivors believe that they're in a relationship, or maybe this dysfunction, this exploitation is their normal. And that's something that we really had to come to understand as advocates, is that my normal is not, your normal, Melissa,
right.
Or everybody has their own normal. So that's just super important. But the bottom line is that pimps are human traffickers. In fact, anyone who profits in any way from the commercial sexual exploitation of another commits the crime of human trafficking. As far as sex purchasers, anyone who exchanges money or goods or services with a pimp for sex with another person also commits the crime of human trafficking.
Mm-hmm. So this really flies in the face of almost everybody's concept of what prostitution is. We typically think of prostitution as just somebody who has a pimp, and it just seems normal, what we see on television, what we see in movies. And then we think of sex trafficking as something completely different. But yeah, like Whitney was saying, that really isn't the case. It's much more complicated.
Right. And just to go off of what you're saying, Melissa, I think the hardest kind of ship to turn around, so to speak,
Yes.
is that kind of this paradigm of thinking about prostitution and this stigma and this judgment of those men and women who are in the commercial sex trade. Just to be completely honest, it's hard, if not impossible, to tell the difference on the surface between prostitution and human trafficking. You can't necessarily see if someone is being controlled by another individual or where the proceeds from the Commercial Sex Act, where that goes. And I'll even go a step further, just any kind of judgment, whether that person in prostitution is a victim of trafficking or not, we really need to work on changing and addressing this judgmental attitude that a lot of us display.
Right. Something that I don't think I probably ever liked this expression, but now, you know how people say prostitution is the world's oldest profession, that somebody chooses this life for themselves. I suppose that happens, but gosh, does that oversimplify and this very complicated issue, and is really indicative of this entrenched mindset. This is why we're doing this podcast. This is why we're working on building awareness during Human Trafficking Awareness Month. This is the kind of thing that needs to get changed.
Right. Agree. And just to provide some clarification, we will talk about, I guess, kind of the legal differences between trafficking and prostitution. So prostitution occurs when someone independently offers sexual services in exchange for money, goods, or services. The difference is that when someone prostitutes themselves or they're being prostituted, he or she is in control of the process and keeps 100% of the money received. So there is no third party or third person who's controlling the process and keeping a portion of the profits. A situation can, again, look like prostitution on the surface, but when we dig a little bit deeper, when we actually know the facts, we know the backstory, so to speak, it's so often pimp-controlled human trafficking. And we even hear from victim survivors that it's very hard to be kind of in this commercial sex trade without a pimp or a manager. That maybe women in the commercial sex trade who are working for themselves are called renegades, and they're kind of almost looked down upon. So that's what we've heard, and I'm sure that it varies, across cultures. But it's just there is this definite distinction between the two. Now, to make it a little bit more complicated, because human trafficking is,
Right.
I always say to people when we're, trying to educate, that human trafficking is very gray. It's not this black and white thing where you can take a hotline call and you say, well, that is prostitution or that is trafficking. So often we speak with women who they go in and out of trafficking situations. So maybe one day they're working for this pimp or this manager, they're being trafficked. And the next day, maybe they had a brutal beating and they try to go it on their own and make their own money and post themselves on Backpage or whatever site. And they want to keep the proceeds because they're tired of turning over all their earnings to this trafficker. So often we see that there's a woman who, when she does this, she almost needs some level of protection, and she chooses to maybe go back to more of a pimp-controlled situation. And I am absolutely, just to clarify, not advocating for pimps or saying that
Right.
they always offer this level of protection or any of that, for sure. However, it's just this going in and out of trafficking situations that certainly makes it more complicated. I think something else that we know as advocates, that this population, human trafficking victims, they have often suffered, again, this complex and chronic trauma. And it's different than other crimes like domestic violence or other things, because essentially these men and women, they're arrested or they're viewed by society as prostitutes. And so there's just this heavy stigma. And so even if they were to get out of the life or they go to seek help, they are so often judged by people who are providing services. And so even if that lifestyle is so hard and it's not a healthy situation, that is still maybe better than facing judgment from society. And so that can essentially be your family. Mm-hmm. That can be the people that you return back to because of the things that you face by other people who just don't understand.
Because of this stigma and because of the complication of sex trafficking, we have these people who are being arrested as prostitutes, not being recognized as victims of sex trafficking. Like Whitney mentioned in a previous podcast, they're most likely not going to self-identify as trafficking victims. The level of coercion traffickers use is going to make a sex trafficking victim think that they chose this life for themselves, that they made decisions along the way, even if these decisions were made because someone was threatening their life, threatening their children. One thing we see too is that the risk for arrest and punishment falls pretty much squarely on the person who is labeled as a prostitute, who is the sex trafficking victim, not really on the trafficker and not really on the sex purchaser.
Right. And we have seen some specialized operations where they are targeting the sex purchasers or Johns, or maybe they're really trying to get more information on the pimps. But so often we work with victim survivors who have been arrested. So we provide advocacy through jail visits, or we try to provide resources. But that's really hard to know that you've been exploited, abused, or whatever, and you're labeled as a criminal. Mm-hmm. And that goes on your criminal record, and you have that felony. And so it's just this cycle. So again, we talked about kind of barriers of getting out of the lifestyle. And so it can be so much harder to get a job or to get an apartment when you have this felony on your record.
Absolutely. And something else to note is that, if someone gets arrested for prostitution, one thing that's going to make it difficult when you're trying to discern if it's prostitution or sex trafficking is the pimp may not be anywhere nearby. They may not even be on the scene. And so that person may very well look like somebody who is just doing this on her own. And, she's not going to turn the pimp in. She's not going to turn that person in, and she's not going to talk about this exploitation, then there's really no reason why somebody would think that it was sex trafficking instead of prostitution if they're not willing to really dig deeper.
Right. Yeah. Totally agree with that. So we often see where pimps are actually controlling the victims or whomever by phone. And so that's just a really easy way to do it without being on the premises or whatever.
So if you've been listening for the past couple of weeks, then you've been hearing a story about a young woman who we're calling Ashley. That's not really her name, but we changed her name to protect her identity. And this is a true story based on a true story of somebody who the Dragonfly Home staff has worked with. And as we're talking about these different misconceptions and the truth of these misconceptions, Ashley's life and her experience in sex trafficking touches on every single one of these points. So we've talked about the fact that she was born and raised in the Oklahoma City area. She was trafficked in the Oklahoma City area by somebody who established himself as her boyfriend so that he could more easily manipulate and coerce her into sex trafficking. And so how does Ashley's story apply to this? Well, just like Whitney was talking about, Ashley, he was definitely a sex trafficking victim. She had this person who was exploiting her and falls under all of the legal definitions of sex trafficking. Ashley met up with a man and he was paying for her services and she was caught. She was arrested and she did not turn in her pimp because he was her boyfriend. And out of loyalty for him and out of love for him, she wanted to protect him from prosecution. So deeply entrenched was that relationship and that level of coercion that she was willing to sort of sacrifice herself. She was willing to take the fall for him. And so she was not identified as a sex trafficking victim. She was identified as a prostitute, and that's the crime that she was charged with. For her to have been identified as a sex trafficking victim would have required digging deeper. On the surface, it didn't look like that. On the surface, it looked like prostitution. But like Whitney said, this is a gray area. It's not black and white. You can't just look at a situation and automatically be able to tell on the surface what is going on. So this misconception is not something that we pulled out of thin air. This is something the Dragonfly team has seen again and again and again with victims of human trafficking we've worked with. So I think that we've about covered it for misconception number 4. Whitney, do you want to talk about Human Trafficking Awareness Month?
Yeah, we have quite a bit going on, and there will be probably things going on in your area as well. So please check out www.thedragonflyhome.org to see everything that's going on in January.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for listening. We will be back with our next misconception.
Thank you.
At the Dragonfly Home Human Trafficking Relief and Restoration Center, victim survivors of human trafficking from Oklahoma and beyond can find help to get a fresh start in life. Our mission is to provide non-residential services, intensive case management, and crisis intervention in a comfortable, home-like setting where victim survivors can access comprehensive services tailored to each individual. We also offer assistance and resources through our 24-hour confidential human trafficking helpline. The Dragonfly Home is a 501c3 nonprofit organization and is state certified by the Oklahoma Office of the Attorney General. For more information, visit www.thedragonflyhome.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.